Around 1200 BC, a ship went down off the southern coast of what is now Turkey, near a headland called Uluburun. It never reached its destination. For over 3,000 years, it sat undisturbed on the seafloor until a sponge diver stumbled onto its wreckage in 1982. What archaeologists pulled up from that wreck wasn't gold or jewels. It was raw metal, roughly a ton of tin ingots, packed alongside 10 tons of copper, enough, by some estimates, to arm an entire army with bronze weapons. A single merchant ship was carrying more military potential in its hold than most palaces held in their treasuries. And the reason has almost nothing to do with copper, and everything to do with a soft, unglamorous, easily forgotten metal that most people today couldn't even picture in their heads. That metal was tin. Picture yourself as a bronze smith 4,000 years ago. You've spent your morning melting copper, pouring it into a mold, shaping a blade you're proud of. And then, in your first real test against another soldier's shield, it folds. Not shatters, folds like wet leather. Copper alone was never going to win a war. So how exactly did early metalworkers turn a soft, bending metal into the material that armed empires for 2,000 years? The answer came from mixing in a small amount of tin, usually somewhere around 10 parts in 100. And that changed everything. The resulting alloy held an edge in combat. It could be poured into far more intricate shapes, tools, hinges, ornamental work, in ways brittle copper never allowed. It resisted corrosion. Historians call this moment the beginning of the Bronze Age, and it's tempting to think of it as simply an upgrade, a better material replacing a worse one. But that undersells what actually happened. Bronze restructured entire societies. Stronger plows meant more food. Stronger axes meant more timber and better ships. Stronger weapons meant the rise of large, coordinated, state-funded armies instead of scattered bands with sharpened sticks. None of that was possible without tin. And here's the problem nobody saw coming. Tin is one of the rarest workable metals on the surface of the earth. Unlike copper, which turns up in scattered deposits across huge stretches of the ancient world, tin ore concentrated itself in only a handful of remote locations, almost none of which sat anywhere near the great civilizations that needed it most. Deposits existed in the mountains near modern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, in pockets near the Taurus Mountains of Anatolia, and most famously, in the tin-rich streambeds of Cornwall, tucked into the far southwestern edge of Britain. Now hold that geography in your mind for a second. The great Bronze Age powers, Egypt, Babylon, the Hittites, the Mycenaean Greeks, were all clustered around the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. The tin they depended on for their entire military technology sat thousands of kilometers away, across mountain ranges, deserts, and in Cornwall's case, across open, genuinely dangerous ocean. This single geographic accident is the reason Bronze Age civilizations were forced to build trade networks stretching across the known world centuries before anyone had drawn a map of it. A sword forged in Mycenae might carry within it copper from one region and tin that had passed through 3 or 4 intermediary traders, originating somewhere near Central Asia. Every weapon, every ceremonial vessel, every hinge on a heavy wooden door carried a hidden geography inside it, a silent record of journeys almost too vast to imagine for the era. Tin didn't just create bronze, it created something resembling globalization 4,000 years before the word existed. So who was moving all of this? Enter the Phoenicians, sailing out of coastal cities in what is now Lebanon, building a maritime trading network almost entirely around the movement of scarce resources. Ancient writers, including Herodotus, referenced legendary tin islands, the Cassiterides, widely believed by scholars to connect to trading points linked with Cornwall, although the precise locations remain debated to this day. Think about what that voyage actually meant. Ships without steel hulls, without modern navigation, without any guarantee of return, sailing past the Strait of Gibraltar, a boundary many Mediterranean peoples considered the literal edge of the known world, into open Atlantic water. All to retrieve a heavy, dull-looking ore that to an outsider resembled nothing more than dark gravel. Meanwhile, an entirely separate supply chain snaked overland through Central Asia, moving slowly from the mountains near ancient Afghanistan toward Mesopotamia, through caravans and river routes and generations of middlemen who likely never met the people at either end of the chain. 2 completely different logistics networks, one maritime, one overland, both converging on the same desperate need. And that need shows up in written records too, not just shipwrecks. The Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic correspondence discovered in Egypt and dated to the 14th century BC, capture kings writing to one another not about marriages or borders, but about metal shipments, because an army's ability to fight depended on a resource that frequently sat outside a kingdom's own borders. Imagine holding that kind of power, ruling an empire capable of building pyramids, commanding armies that could conquer neighboring kingdoms, and still being one broken supply line away from being unable to arm your own soldiers. Around 1200 BC, that vulnerability caught up with almost everyone at once. Within the span of a few decades, the interconnected Bronze Age world came apart with terrifying speed. The Hittite Empire, once one of the dominant powers of the Near East, disintegrated. Mycenaean palace centers across Greece were destroyed and abandoned. Cities across the Levant and Anatolia burned in patterns archaeologists are still piecing together today. Trade networks that had linked Egypt, the Aegean, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia for centuries simply stopped functioning. So what actually caused it? Historians have proposed drought, earthquake clusters, mass migrations of the mysterious sea peoples, internal rebellion, and systemic political fragility. And most modern scholars, including archaeologist Eric Klein, whose research has shaped much of the current thinking on this period, now favor some combination of these pressures rather than one single trigger. But there's a thread running underneath nearly all of these theories. Complex interconnected systems are fragile by nature, and the Bronze Age trade network, with tin sitting at one of its most geographically concentrated choke points, was exactly that kind of brittle system. When war, migration, and chaos disrupted the routes carrying tin out of Cornwall, Central Asia, and Anatolia, the damage rippled outward violently. Armies couldn't be rearmed. Weapon production faltered at the precise moment kingdoms needed military strength the most. And in the aftermath, something telling happened. Regions across the collapsing world increasingly turned to a different metal, iron, which unlike tin could be found almost everywhere, requiring no fragile international supply chain to access at all. The rise of the Iron Age wasn't purely a story of a better metal winning out. It was, in part, a hard lesson learned by civilizations that had just watched their entire world collapse because they'd built their survival on a resource they never physically controlled. Now fast forward past the collapse, past the fall of bronze as the world's dominant technology, and ask yourself whether tin actually disappeared from history after that. It didn't. It just went quiet. Walk into your kitchen and open a can of food. That object exists because of a 19th century innovation built on tin-coated steel, a technology that transformed how humanity preserved and transported food, feeding soldiers, explorers, and eventually entire nations. Pick up the phone in your pocket right now. Somewhere beneath its glass surface sit thousands of microscopic connections, welded together with tin-based solder, holding together the circuitry that makes the device function at all. Without that solder, modern computing, from smartphones to satellites, would be structurally impossible. Go further still, into the vast data centers currently training the artificial intelligence systems reshaping the modern world. Soldered into the heart of those servers is the same soft, forgettable metal once melted for kings. And in a strange historical echo, tin remains geographically concentrated even now, with major modern production coming out of China, Indonesia, Myanmar, and Peru, alongside significant, often controversial mining operations in Central Africa. The same fragile chain that once stretched from Cornwall to Mesopotamia now stretches from remote mines to the factories assembling the devices sitting in your hands. One serious disruption, one conflict, one blockade, and the flow of this metal could falter exactly as it did 32 centuries ago. Because here's the uncomfortable truth underneath this entire story. The end of the Bronze Age didn't arrive as a single dramatic invasion that historians can point to on a map. It arrived in large part as an absence, a supply line thousands of miles long that finally broke under pressure. The kings who watched their world collapse in 1200 BC never saw it coming because they had stopped noticing the ships that made their civilization possible in the first place. We are still standing on the same foundation they were. Our phones, our vehicles, our servers, our entire connected world, held together, quite literally, by the same forgotten metal that once built and then unmade the ancient world. We've just made the very same mistake they did. We've simply stopped noticing the ships.